A draft Security Council resolution demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza is expected to be put vote today and draw a U.S. veto in the process. The resolution was drawn up by Algeria, which is the Arab representative on the council. Washington's envoy has been steadfast in her view that any action in the council would undermine efforts to secure a new hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. Let's discuss this further. SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease now joins us. Sherwin, good afternoon, South African time. From your vantage point, as we await the announcement, how do you see today's vote going, considering that the US warned over the weekend that Algeria's text was not acceptable, even threatening to veto it?
Liesl, we expect high drama but low yields, right? No results, essentially, because the United States has very clearly indicated that it does not support Algeria's draft resolution, calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. This is a process that kicked off soon after the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, issued those provisional measures against Israel around the end of January, around the 29th of January. So 3 weeks later, Algeria now wants to put this text to a vote. And what happened yesterday? The United States, Liesl, introduced a competing draft resolution. So in a sense, providing themselves with cover here, were they now to move forward later this morning here in New York and veto, as expected, that Algerian resolution. Let me tell you what the United States draft resolution says. It underscores its support for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza as soon as practicable, based on the formula of all hostages being released, and calls for the lifting of all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance at scale, as previously demanded in resolutions 2712 and 2720, both of which would help to create the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities, as called for in previous resolutions. So the big difference between the Algerian draft resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire, demanding the immediate release of hostages, denouncing the forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza, the United States is seeking to link its call for a temporary ceasefire as soon as practicable to the regional negotiations led by Qatar, the United States, Egypt, mediating between Israel and Hamas, seeking to link the action in the council to those negotiations. What the United States is essentially saying, Liesl, is that's the main game in town. Those negotiations are where our focus needs to be. And they believe that the Algerian draft in its current form will not be constructive to that process. So in a sense, undermining the veracity, the effect, the impact of the council action here in favor of the diplomatic negotiations being led by the United States and Qatar in the region.
Well, Sherwin, speaking of the US's competing draft resolution, the US now supports the appeal with a draft resolution to the UN Security Council calling for that temporary ceasefire. I wonder at this point what's changed, considering that just days ago Washington was preparing to send more bombs and other weapons to Israel.
Pressure, right? Diplomatic pressure. The United States didn't want to seem to be isolated yet. The United States has to use its veto. That would mean that the resolution will receive at least the 9 minimum votes required. We've seen other countries like the United Kingdom, for example, abstain on these types of resolutions. We know that the United States has vetoed 2 similar humanitarian resolutions in the past. So they do not want to be seen as standing in the way of some humanitarian relief, given the acute situation we all know to be true on the ground in Gaza. So the pressure has been building on the United States. We've seen a shift in the United States posture. The conversations between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu have been more pointed, given the civilian casualties, almost 30,000 Palestinians now that have perished since this war began on October 7th last year. And so the United States is feeling the diplomatic pressure, but also feels that it needs to favor those negotiations in the region, because they believe it's the only way we are going to see progress. Israel is known for ignoring council resolutions. So even if this one were to pass, say the United States, for example, abstains on the Algerian text, there is no guarantee that Israel will comply with the prescripts of that resolution. So they are making the case here. Let's not go the Algerian way. Let's go in our direction that supports this diplomatic effort in the region, because that's the best bet we have of seeing the hostages released in return for a temporary ceasefire. Of course, the bigger demand here from the international community led by Algeria and countries like South Africa is that this war has gone on long enough. The humanitarian imperative here demands that we have a humanitarian ceasefire now, a permanent humanitarian ceasefire, and that is the big difference between the US text and the Algerians. The US talks about a temporary ceasefire, which I think lends itself to the continued ability of Israel, quote unquote, to continue its operation in self-defense.
And Sherwin, just as we wrap up, speaking of political pressure, the ICJ hearings, what's also emerging on that front? Just also looking at the fact that, as you alluded to, time is running out.
Well, there's so many processes, right? You've got 2 resolutions, you've got 2 court cases now that are currently ongoing before the International Court of Justice. Of course, Israel is due to report back near the end of this month, given the 1-month report that the ICJ demanded of Israel on the implementation of those provisional measures. That's going to make for interesting reading. And then you also have another process that was initiated by that General Assembly resolution in December 2020, calling on the ICJ to pronounce itself on the legality of Israel's continued occupation and what the legal ramifications for this continued occupation are on member states of the United Nations and the United Nations itself. What is the legal basis for the continued occupation here, especially given the expansion we have seen of Israeli settlements in violation of international law in territories that Palestinians are seeking for a future Palestinian state? So very important processes here. Unfortunately, the ICJ process could take months to years to resolve itself. The Security Council resolutions are more acute, although the United States has made it clear they are not putting their draft to a vote today. We will only get a vote on the Algerian draft, which is likely to be vetoed. The United States says it needs to negotiate. It's ready to engage with council members around this, despite, of course, the urgency we know to be true on the ground, Liesl.
Sherwin, thank you very much for weighing in.